we are going to be discussing Barley
Argonomics.
Let's go, Barley Argonomics!
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about, as my son Isaac said, Barley Argonomics. He's a lively young man. He enjoys getting all excited. That is Isaac. He's my 6-year-old, and Therese, who is about to be 11. I'm sure they will make a few more cameos in their time over these well-crafted videos that I have promised you. How we're going to handle today, and quite a bit of the lecture is we're going to be using your book pretty thoroughly. You have a few options as far as that goes, as far as how you're going to lay this stuff out. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you a situation where the information that you're going to need, that you're going to be evaluated on, is available to you and has been explained in a variety of ways, and you've had a variety of opportunities to interact with that information. All right. Now, what I've done is, with my textbook, I've gotten these sassy little page dividers here. Okay, section by section, you can do that. If you look into your assignment portion, the assignment paper that I gave you, you're going to see all the stuff that you're going to be responsible for on the midterm. There's going to be some things that we highlight in class that will not be on your midterm, and some of those things are just some of those little interconnecting pieces, right? But really what I want is, for your midterm and final, I want you to really have the meat and potatoes of the course. And I want you to be able to show me that you're picking up what you need to at the end of this course. Again, this isn't a situation where I'm concerned about you getting this grade or this grade. At the end of the course, I want to be able to have conversations with you about beer. I want to be hearing good questions. People can talk about, there's no such thing as bad question, and that's fine. I'm not worried. I don't want you to be worried about, asking a bad question or anything like that. But I also want to see the conversation that we have in class develop, right? Like if it's the same nuts and bolts stuff that we're going to be covering in the first couple of weeks. And we're having that conversation, in week 10, 11, whatever. That won't be reflecting well on how you're picking up with class, right? So we're trying to create, that integrated knowledge that I was talking about in the first time we met in class. So, just one moment, please. What we'll be doing is these lectures, some of them, they're primarily going to be themed as a guided reading. So we'll be going through different questions in your book, and we're going to be starting off with chapter 2 on barley malt and malting, and we're going to be picking through some of that stuff today, and really, we want to start putting together the foundation of what beer is, its constituents, and all the factors that go into producing a pleasing final product for the consumer. And that begins with malt. Now, I just realized usually I try to cough to that side a little bit. My headphones right here, or my microphone's right here, so maybe that one was extra loud if it was. I apologize. I had the flu like 2 weeks ago. It was not good. And the cough is still sticking around. So if you want to join me on page 15 of volume 1 of your text, we're going to go ahead and start looking at right away. We're going to start looking at question number 1 with what is malt, and it's going to give you kind of a rundown here, and you're going to want to incorporate this information. This is malt is grain that has been steeped, germinated, and kilned according to certain procedures. Malted grain differs from raw grain in several different ways. Before we jump into those ways, the kind of core concept right there where it says malt is grain that has been steeped, germinated, and kilned according to certain procedures. What they want to have going on is with the barley is they actually want to create a situation where they get it moist and give it the opportunity to start growing, and then they want to arrest that process by drying it out, right? And then once it's dried out, they can toast it, they can roast it. If you want to think about like how bread toasts and starts to get more and more browning, more and more Maillard reactions, more and more flavor, like a piece of toast, right? Or think about roast and coffee, chocolate, things like that in that range. That's kind of the different procedures portion when it says to kind of generate a different end flavor with it. But going on to the 4 points about how malted grain differs from raw grain. The first one is malt contains less moisture and is therefore more suitable for storage and grinding, right? Because this is stuff that's going to be held for a while. It's not all going to be used at once. And it needs to be stable, both for the maltster, so they can hold inventory, and then also secondarily to the brewer, and so they can maintain inventory. The endosperm of malted grain has been modified and is mellow in contrast to the hard endosperm of the original kernel. So it's taking that next process of making it a little bit easier to deal with from a milling standpoint. It says malted grain has much higher enzymatic values than raw grain. We're going to get into enzyme activity quite a bit. And what they're talking about is with these enzymes reflect directly into diastatic power. It's basically a malt's ability to convert starch to sugar. Okay, and usually the paler a malt is, the more diastatic power it has. All right, the more you kiln it, you start to kind of knock off those. You kind of reduce that amount of diastatic power or its enzymatic power, right? And malted grain has flavor and aroma, and its components can be readily extracted during the brewing process. So what we're saying is that we're increasing the storability of, this is why we take a raw product and turn it into malt. We're increasing the storability, we're increasing its usefulness, and we're also increasing the range of flavor that it can contribute to the final beer. And that's something that you're going to find that the class is going to have some cyclical portions to it, right? When we're brewing, when we have these lectures, this stuff is going to come back. Being the first time that I'm doing these lectures like this, if there's any questions that you have, or sometimes I get excited and talk fast, or I'm difficult to understand, please just either shoot me an email, take a note of it, and we can ask right at the beginning whenever we do the Q&A on that. All right. The next question we're going to be looking at is number 5, and that is on page 16. And I'm going to, like I said, the quality of these videos I'm sure will increase over time, but this is what we're looking at, right? There you are. This is kind of the little diagram of the whole barley kernel. That's what I want you peeking at when we look at this next section. Question number 5 says, what parts make up the barley kernel? We're going to kind of do a glossing of this section, right? We're not going to be diving incredibly deep into some of the topics in here, and the reason is I want you to have a practical understanding of what's going on, and I want it to be useful, right? I can't. I mean, you can dig into this stuff, but it's also stuff that can be looked up too. But there are a few items that I want you to be aware of right here. And when we're looking at that barley kernel, it talks about the outer layers, the husk, and it talks about the pericarp and the testa. That's not stuff I'm really going to be digging into so much. The primary thing we're going to be talking about as far as the outer layer is the husk. All right, and the husk is this. It's like a thin. It's just like a little thin sheet that can be broken off. Right, it's easy if you took some malt and you spun it in your fingers, you could chip all that off and it would just crumble off, and then you would just have the endosperm underneath it. But that husk though is really important, right? That husk for the brewing process is really very, very important. What you're gonna see is flavor comes from that. All right. If you remove husk from malt, and especially like roast malt, you're going to significantly change the flavor and overall character of that malt. If you use something like a roasted barley that can give like a black coffee or dark chocolate thing, and you remove the husk, a good portion of the actual roast character is going to be removed. And sometimes people say like the potential bitterness that you can get from that, or like the harshness, is going to be removed. So this husk plays a really big role in flavor, but it also plays another very functional role too. And the functional role is when we get into all grain brewing, we're going to talk about this a little more. But this husk is what is going to allow you to extract wort, or the sugary water that's like pre-beer, right? It's going to allow you to extract that from the grain. All right. So what happens is when we're making beer, the first step is we take our milled malt. All right. So there's some powder, there's some small chunks, but there's also quite a bit of husk, right? And we don't want that husk shredded up just down to nothing, because it's going to create a filter bed. If you think about the mash as like oatmeal, right? Oatmeal starts with a grain, and then you hydrate it, and that kind of gets gluey and gelatinous. But when we're mashing, it's actually like you would have all this grain and then a layer of water above it, and all the grain has been hydrated and brought into a temperature range where starch can turn to sugar. In order to get that liquid out, if there was no husk in play at all, it wouldn't be able to filter through. You would end up with that oatmeal situation I was just talking about. All the finings and small particulate of starch would just glob up and brick up in your mash tun. And then you wouldn't be able to drop water through it and steep that through, right? So the integrity of that husk at the beginning of the brew process is very important. All right. Otherwise, it can create some very long days, loss of efficiency, and things like that. So that's why we're focusing on the outer portion of the husk. The next section we'll look at is the endosperm, or the starch-bearing portion of the grain. You've already heard me talk about it as far as converting starch to sugar, right? That's the other key element. When you take malt unmilled, so it's just whole kernels, and you eat it, and you should do that regularly. I mean, especially if you're doing this for a living, you should know what your malt tastes like. Like when you bust open a new lot of malt that you have coming, you need to taste it, You need to smell it. You need to look at it, make sure that it's straight. Otherwise, you could be ended up, with something funky going on there. You want it to, like base malts. The base malts are like the white bread of the brewing world, right? Like it goes a long way. The super majority of malt that you're using in your beer is generally base malt, and that's like 80% of the beer, sometimes up to 100% of the beer. Base malt gives you that yellow beer, right? And then you can build it with, you can build more flavor and color with other specialty malts. But you want to taste that, and you want to know what that raw, starchy flavor is. And you can taste it sometimes, and it's kind of bright and bready and maybe like a little bit like grape nuts. I don't know if they still make grape nuts. It used to be a cereal. I don't know if people eat it anymore. Go and get yourself a box of grape nuts. Well, let's see. We're going to eat a fair amount of malt in class, at least not a fair amount, but you'll have the opportunity to taste kernels of malt in class, and so you'll kind of see what I'm talking about there. But that endosperm is key. I think it's one of the, just from a hands-on sensory standpoint, it's really the bulk of what's inside inside the kernel. And what's inside the grain, and if it tastes musty, if it tastes like a basement, moldy, like papery, like wet cardboard or something like that, if kind of that kind of thing going on, you're gonna know you have something you don't want. If it's smushy, right? Sorry about that. If it's mushy, if you chew it and there's nothing solid to it, you don't feel the starch breaking apart, no good. All right. If it's glassy, like you bite it and it's like really hard and like shattering in your mouth, that's not good either. All right. You should be able to turn it into a powder, right? You should be able to turn it into a powder. So we've talked about the husk and the endosperm. As being the starch-bearing portion of the grain. The reason that we're bringing up the endosperm is that's the second major thing. You need the husk in order to filter out the mash, so you get flow through your mash, and you need that starch to generate sugar. All right, because that's really what we're doing. We're creating that sugar level, the sugar level. We're creating that sugar environment for yeast to go to town in. All right. We're not going to dive too much further into that one right there. That's really all you're going to need to know. And just also know is this is going to be also within the barley kernel, there is also potential enzymes, things like that. And these enzymes will be the things that are actually converting the starch to sugar. All right? I'm going to have you jump up to question number 24 with me. And what are the main steps in the production of malt? We're gonna kind of jump through this one a little bit. And I want to get you to the more key points with it. Your book says, barley selection, storing, cleaning, and sizing. I'm not interested in that, because that part of it, I mean, you can geek out on that and really go into it. That's great, but from a very practical standpoint, the other three steps that we're going to look at are far more important to understanding what's actually happening with malt, and that's what I'd like to focus on, both for your midterm and for our discussions in class. So, for the main steps in the production of malt from barley, we're going to start with steeping. It's C. All right, we're cutting out barley selection. We're cutting out storing, cleaning, and sizing. We don't interface with that stuff, all right, as brewers. But this steeping process, it helps to explain this helps to explain what's actually happening for us in the brew house. With steeping, it says the purpose of steeping is to evenly hydrate the endosperm mass to a moisture content of approximately 45% to allow uniform growth during germination. So see, what we're looking to actually get this kernel to start germinating. Steeping also cleans the barley by washing and eliminating lightweight kernels. It is generally considered the most crucial step in the production of high-quality malt. Let's stick with that first portion, right? I'm not really worried about that concept of rinsing away smaller things and everything like that. But we're looking to build the moisture content up in the kernel, because when you do that, it's naturally going to want to start growing, right? So they're going to steep them, and then they're going to wait for the next step, which is germination. So the kernels are allowed to grow under controlled temperature and humidity conditions. And each maltster is going to be doing these things differently based on the flavors that they want to develop and also the types of barley that they're handling in-house. I'm sure that they have, like these really big-time maltsters. They really know what they're doing. There's a lot of science involved. And so I'm sure their process is pretty repeatable, but there's going to be things that they're measuring and looking for to make sure that they maintain a consistent product. And then kilning, all right? It said the kernels are dried by exposure to heat and airflow. Kilning stops growth, so it arrests growth, produces flavor, aroma, and color to the malt. And it also results in a more stable product, all right? So that it's that kilning portion at the end, and just like when I made the analogy of toast. So if I tell you that a beer is toasty, or if I tell you that a beer is bread crusty, like it's like white bread crust, if you just take the crust off the bread and just eat that, that's kind of what's going on here. So when we talk about toasty, I'm talking about toasting that bread and then scraping just the brown part off and just eating that. All right. Toasting gives a depth of flavor, right? It makes it more than just a piece of Wonder Bread, all right? And different things like that. Okay, so it's flavor development, it's color development, and yeah, brewers are basically, or maltsters are going to be making one of a few different types of malt, and one is going to be base malt, which is like this paler type deal that would just kind of make yellow beer, right, and kind of lower flavor. They can use caramel malts, so it's malt that's actually already been turned to sugar and has caramel characters, right? They can have roasted malt with the coffee, dark chocolate thing going on, things like that. So that's how the maltster is interacting with that. And that's pretty much what we're going to cover as far as that goes. And I want to dig a little bit deeper in with the idea of malt modification. We have a situation now where years ago it was not like this. So like you can listen to Dr. Michael Lewis. He is one of my huge beer crushes out there. I think he's like 90, and he's British and has that killer British accent, and he just sounds so smart, and he is so smart. So Dr. Michael Lewis will say, by the time you're done mixing your hot liquor water, or your hot water, with your grain, and it's kind of resting there, and you're waiting for starch to convert to sugar, he said that process is almost happening instantly. Okay. When a lot of people brew, they will, when they mash in or whatever people like to call it, they will rest for an hour. All right, they'll give that process an hour, I don't think that's necessary these days. And the reason has to do with this concept of malt modification. With improved technology, maltsters are able to create malt that are so high in enzymes, right, that they convert starch to sugar very, very quickly. In years past, many decades past, um, you're going to see the Germans doing something called decoction mashing, which we'll touch on briefly later in the course. But it was because they could not get their starch to convert to sugar easily that they had to take these other end arounds, right? They had to do these other processes to try to get the starch to convert to sugar. And now that the technology has caught up so well on the malt side, that the science is caught up, um, they're making highly modified malt, and it converts its starch to sugar with ease. So let's take a look at this malt modification concept. It says malt modification is the degree to which barley has been transformed from raw grain into malted grain. Well-modified malt is malt that has been processed from good quality barley under conditions promoting the uniform breakdown of the starches and protein in the barley. Modification of raw grain during malting converts the kernel from a hard, steely endosperm with low enzyme content to a friable, easily milled endosperm high in diastatic enzymes. So it's increasing, the malting process is increasing the malt ability to convert starch to sugar. A raw grain might break your tooth if you chewed into it, whereas a modified malted grain will crunch easily. Large brew houses in the United States use mash mixers and temperature program. I lost my spot. Large brew houses in the United States using mash mixers and temperature programming can use a less modified malt successfully. But infusion mash brew house, which is most of us. Infusion mash means that you are taking grain and infusing it with water, or taking water and infusing it with grain, however you want to do that dance. But an infusion mash will require a more highly modified malt for best performance. So, the darker a base malt is, the less enzymes it has. All right. And how do you generate color in toast? It's time, right? Okay, so you push that timer down, you crank the little switch up, and it just leaves it in there longer, and it starts to toast it more and more, and it'll even get toward burnt, right? The longer you kiln malt, the further you get it toward that burnt toast range, the less and less it has the ability to convert starch to sugar. All right. So we're going to keep working with these concepts more. The editing on this, again, I know is not super good. I wanted to get this stuff out, and we'll see. I would like some honest praise or feedback, depending on how you want to look at that. I would, seriously, I would appreciate some feedback on how easy this is to hear. If something I'm doing is driving you crazy. I say the word if you don't notice that. I've had students tell me that for, more than a decade. So you won't be hurting my feelings when you tell me that I say something that I'm working on. But, Next up, I'm going to be chatting at you about our brew day, and specifically Saison. All right, everybody. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about Saison as a style right now. It's a style that I am a huge fan of. It's a very light, crisp, refreshing beer. I think it's a good one for us to start off with for our class because it's interesting from a use perspective. I think a lot of times when you go into a craft beer bar right now, you can find a lot of spiced beers, beers with a lot of specialty ingredients. And the interesting thing about Saison is that you can spice these beers and you can do different things with them. But even a more experienced taster would taste these beers and feel as if there is actually something else added into them, when in fact it's really just the yeast character. Let me go ahead through and read just a little bit of a description about it. I know you already have some background from the classwork that you've done, so this should be in support of that, and then we'll flesh this out a little bit. This information is being taken from the 2015 style guidelines for the Beer Judge Certification Program, which is also known as the BJCP. What they do is they certify judges, and you have to be able to pass a test of various types in order to be a recognized certified master level judge, things like that. I myself am a certified judge. I got into that, the beer judging side of things, very early in my homebrew days, as I mentioned in the other class. So yeah, the resources on bjcp.org are free. If you are kind of a style nerd, I'm sure there's some other stuff within the program that would be really beneficial for you to use a style guideline like that. That's available, and that's what we're going to be checking out right now. As far as the BJCP goes, kind of the background on Saison. They call it a provision ale, originally brewed in Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium. It was made for consumption during the active farming season. So obviously you're looking at warm weather and something that's going to be thirst quenching. You wouldn't assume you're going to be drinking like a 9% stout or something like that. Originally a lower alcohol product, so as not to debilitate field workers. I enjoyed the idea of debilitating field workers. But tavern strength products also existed. Higher strength and different colored products appeared after World War II. The best known modern Saison, which is a huge favorite of mine, Saison DuPont. We will taste that in class. It's really one. I think it's one of the more versatile. I think it's one of the more versatile beers out there. To segue here a little bit, I think when it comes to food pairing, I think there's some really exciting things that you can do with Saison. I think a pretty good swap out for it is if you were to be talking about, if you're a wine person and you wanted to be able to sub in something that would take the place of like your white wine. For a food pairing, I think Saison does a really good job of that. But Saison DuPont is really it's really the pinnacle. I was able to take a trip to Belgium and was pretty fortunate to taste that beer there, along with some other killer Saisons, and they just have this bright, fresh character to them, and I think it's a combination of the hop flavor that they have that can sometimes be herbal or floral. They use the term spicy, and I'm not crazy about that descriptor, and I'm sure you'll hear me say this several times in the course. But I'm not crazy about the descriptor spicy. I think a lot of times people start thinking about explicitly like peppers, like hot peppers, like heat spice, and I think we should be trying to narrow those things down a little bit. But Saison DuPont's terrific, and we will be sampling that. DuPont was first produced in the 1920s. They're going to use some different words here that you might hear me make fun of a little bit during lecture. It says, originally a rustic artisanal ale made with local farm-produced ingredients, it is now brewed mostly in larger breweries, yet retains the image of its humble origins. Sometimes people will lump this under the category of farmhouse. I think there's some real generalized, fairly meaningless terms that we use from a branding standpoint, because everybody's trying to create separation. Professionally, you know what I mean. As much as I think there's a lot of unity in the brewing community. I mean, ultimately, you know, we're also running businesses too, right? So you're always looking for a way to differentiate yourself, and I think we kind of get into this situation where we start using words that don't really mean anything. I'm not huge on the term artisanal. I'm not huge on the term craft, and I am not huge on the term farmhouse. But anyways, it's a way that you can try to explain what you're going for. Saison. So when people say farmhouse, it carries this concept of like things that you're doing, ingredients that you're using, that it's local, that it's small. And that's cool. And that's one of the reasons why these styles can incorporate multiple adjuncts. Adjuncts are things that are not like the core ingredients in beer. So yeah, characteristic ingredients, and this will spin off of a little bit of what we talked about earlier in the barley side. It says not typically spiced. All right, you can spice a saison. It's pretty unnecessary. You can get a lot of flavor out of the yeast character. And I think sometimes, and you also hear me talk about this quite a bit, I think it's better to go on the lighter side with those spices and adjuncts and things like that, and then dial them up, right? Because if you end up having a certain amount of character coming from your yeast, and then you're amplifying it with your actual spicing, that was my wife. You can say hi. What you end up getting is you end up getting a situation where all you're getting in the beer is spice. And I'm a very firm believer that you want to be able to strike some sort of balance with that. And yeah, so not typically spiced, with the yeast, hops, and grain providing the character. But spices are allowed if they provide a complementary character. They use the term continental-based malts. Continental-based malts meaning generally something Pilsner-based, something light and pale, like the extract that we'll be using for this week. Continental-based malts are typical, but the grist frequently contains other grains such as wheat, oats, rye, or spelt. Again, the things that are going to be grown in that area. And pretty much everything they mention is like a bodybuilder, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more ingredient-wise as we go. Adjuncts such as sugar and honey can also serve to add complexity and dry out the beer. Sugar and honey will definitely dry your beer out. They are simple sugars, which will ferment out completely. It is difficult to get a lot of honey flavor into a beer, especially if you allow it to ferment out. But sometimes you can hold on to aromatics and things like that. So anytime we're talking about using simple sugar like that, I think we're really talking about drying the beer out and making it crisp. Darker versions will typically use richer, darker malts, but not typically roasted types. And they're going to talk about typical European hops, Saaz, Styrian, East Kent Goldings, different things like that. Again, it says a wide range of herbs and spices can add complexity and uniqueness, but should always meld well with the yeast character and hop character. So that's kind of my spiel on saison. One of the reasons that I want to that I do this beer first is because it is an approachable beer. I think a wide number of people that drink beer can drink saison and not be, have a difficult time drinking a pint of it. And there's some decent dry strains for it right now. There's a strain called Belle Saison, which will give you a very, very, very dry Saison. It'll generate a lot of character on its own. If we spice it or not, we're probably just going to be featuring that Belle Saison yeast. So yeah, I don't know. Like I said, we'll taste that. It's a really exciting one. It's light, crisp. You'll usually see it in the big like 750 with the cork and cage on it. And the cork and cage is classy, first of all. You always know you're drinking classy beer when you cork and cage it. I have a friend that is an excellent brewer, and I always like to give him a hard time because he doesn't like to praise himself, and he makes excellent beer. And I know he's always like figuring out ways to be unhappy with his finished product. And so whenever he talks about cork and caging something, I always ask him, do you think it's good enough? And then that just triggers his, fear of not being good enough as a brewer. And that's what friends do. So I think that's pretty much going to be the rundown on Saison. Oh, no, I need to jump back. I'm not going to edit that, but we will just pretend that little part in the center didn't happen. Usually see cork and cage. And you're also going to see a thicker glass on this. The reason is a typical craft beer is carbed anywhere between like 2.4 volumes of carbonation up to 2.6. Saison's going to be higher. You can see Saison going up anywhere above 3. You can see it be champagne-like, right, with all those bubbles. And it's one of the things that makes the beer really refreshing. But you saw me drinking before my carbonated water. Pardon me. Carbonated water is an interesting palate education. I don't know if you guys are LaCroix people or not. I would recommend it. This class is actually sponsored. That's not true. Don't listen to that. But the great thing about LaCroix is between LaCroix and Bud Light, Michelob Ultra, any of those really light beers, the primary flavor in this and in a Bud Light is carbonation. It's carbonic acid, all right? And acid is one of the things that helps to balance a beer, right? Typically, a lot of beers will use bitterness to counteract sweetness, but you can also, acid also falls on that balancing side as well. So one of the things they do is they really carbonate these beers. And you can call them spritzy or whatever. And it looks cool. You get to take the cork and cage, you can take the cage off, and then you can pop that thing. I'll probably put a towel over it in class because I'm very civilized. But tasty beers in that big, thick bottle because of the volume, the high volume of carbonation that they have in it. We're going to talk about carbonation and the way that dialing up carbonation and down will affect kind of the finished beer and all that stuff.